Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We still have lots of people joining, so I'm going to give it one more minute to let people finish getting signed in, and we'll get started at about 1 minute after. We have lots of people joining today, so it's just taken a little bit for everybody to get signed on. All right, let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining today's webinar. My name is Carrie Pascal, and I'm the Director of Outreach here at Team Guardify. Prior to this role, I worked directly with child advocacy centers and in a district attorney's office, providing services to families and victims. If you're not familiar with Guardify, we are a digital evidence management solution designed to support child advocacy centers, child protective services, prosecutors, advocates, law enforcement, and others across the country in securely managing, storing, and safeguarding critical evidence. We're honored to host today's webinar, Understanding the Fundamentals of Human Trafficking. As January is Human Trafficking Awareness Month, Team Guardify stands in solidarity with all survivors of human trafficking. Oh, sorry. Some quick housekeeping notes before I turn it over to our amazing presenter today. If you would like a copy of the presentation slides, you can access them in the chat box. My amazing coworker, Melissa, is going to be uploading them there for you. Please also be on the lookout for another email to hit your inbox later this afternoon that will explain to you how to complete the evaluation form, which will allow you to receive your certificate of completion. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them in the Q&A box and not by raising your hand. We've got a very large group today, so our presenter is going to wait until the very end to address any of the questions. Any questions they're unable to answer live today will be answered via email. I want you all to be aware of some upcoming events and exciting news. On Tuesday, February 27th, we are hosting our next live webinar called YOLO, Strategies for Intentional MDT Leadership. So be on the lookout for registration information on that webinar coming soon. Also, have you checked out Guardify's Real Evidence podcast? Join Ashley and Myron as they explore how technology, people, and processes unite to reshape the landscape of justice and community. Subscribe now. There's lots of amazing episodes released there. I am so excited to introduce today's presenter, Jessica Brazeal Slaven. Jessica is a seasoned therapist and passionate advocate for survivors of trauma, with a focus on supporting women affected by abuse, control, and domestic violence. With over 15 years of experience, Jessica began her career at Genesis Women's Shelter and Support, where she rose to the role of Director of Clinical and Professional Services, helping women process trauma and regain their strength. She also led a team of 20 therapists, providing thousands of hours of therapy to women and children in Dallas. Jessica further contributed to the community as the coordinator of clinical services at Highland Park United Methodist Church, and later as chief programs officer at New Friends, New Life, where she supported survivors of sex trafficking. She is certified in EMDR and trained in several trauma-informed modalities, including TFCBT and DBT. A proud member of the LGBTQIA+ community, Jessica holds a bachelor's in journalism from Texas A&M University and a master's in biblical counseling from the Dallas Theological Seminary. She currently lives in East Dallas with her wife, children, and their many pets, and is a co-owner of the Haven Wellness Center. I will now, Jessica, turn it over to you, and you can take it away.
All right. Thanks so much, Carrie. Okay, so glad to be with everybody today. I'm glad you all are interested in this topic. We are going to walk through, I'm really going to focus on Sex trafficking specifically, human trafficking is kind of the broad umbrella term used to include both sex trafficking and labor trafficking. The entirety of my experience mostly has been around working with survivors of sex trafficking. So I'm going to focus on that, although many of the dynamics that are existing in labor trafficking are the same kind of dynamics that are happening with sex trafficking. So just to make that distinction, when you hear human trafficking, you are hearing an inclusive word that it means both sex trafficking and labor trafficking. So to start us off, I'm just going to talk through a couple of myths that we hear about this issue. One of those being that trafficking is defined by the crossing of a state or a border. And that only foreign nationals or people from other countries can be victims of trafficking, meaning that this cannot happen to American citizens. I think often people think when they hear this word, they think about what actually is more sex tourism. When someone goes to a place and engages it with individuals who are being trafficked that are not here, and or that have been brought here from another country for the purposes of having sex sold or having their work and their ability to work being compromised, and those things are not the actual way that this plays itself out. So someone can be a trafficking victim. I'm in Dallas, Texas. Someone can be a trafficking victim in Dallas, Texas, who is a native of Dallas, Texas, and never leaves Dallas. Victims of human trafficking can also be men and women. They can be adults and children, and they can be U.S. citizens and also people from other countries. So it is not inclusive of only one particular group. This is a pretty broad issue that affects lots of different kinds of people. So just to clarify in way of kind of what we're talking about in terms of who this affects. So when we talk about sex trafficking, the legal definition is that this occurs when someone uses force, fraud, or coercion. Those three words are very important: force, fraud, or coercion, to cause a commercial sex act with an adult or causes a minor to commit a commercial sex act. So the use with an adult, you have to be able to prove in a legal situation that there was either force, fraud, or coercion that was involved. You do not have to prove the same thing with a minor, that any involvement of a minor in a commercial sex act automatically becomes child sex trafficking. Commercial sex acts, as you can see, are listed there. Any form of prostitution, pornography, sexual performance done in exchange for items of value, such as money, drugs, shelter, food, or clothing. And we're going to talk more about all of the many ways that that can present itself. But the important thing to take from this slide and thinking in terms of proving sex trafficking are those words: force, fraud, or coercion with adults, and with children, any person that causes a minor to commit a commercial sex act. So then if we look at labels, we hear all sorts of labels being used, and the language and rhetoric around this issue and these labels has evolved over time and has evolved as this movement to end sex trafficking specifically has kind of matured over the years. We have seen, back in 2000 was actually the first time there was any sort of federal legislation. The TVP, or the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, was put into place that gave us that first definition of sex trafficking. Prior to that, we did not have a definition of that. And so in terms of a movement, this movement is still relatively young to end sex trafficking. I worked, as Carrie mentioned, at Genesis Women's Shelter at the beginning of my career, and kind of the movement to work to address and end domestic violence has been going on far longer. So Genesis, for instance, was created in the 1980s. And so at that time, that particular organization was working to provide shelter and housing and clothing and all the things for women who were being abused by their partners. And it was another almost 20 years before there was even a definition of this issue of trafficking. So just important to see kind of the youth of that movement, and as in any movement, as things have progressed and developed, the language has changed. And in many ways, this particular movement of addressing trafficking has followed in the footsteps of the domestic violence and violence against women movement as well. So kind of following in those same patterns and trends and trajectories. So if we look at some of the labels used for youth, we hear all the time child prostitution, which is an oxymoron because a child cannot be a prostitute. So child pornography, that is And the reason is because that is child sexual abuse. Juvenile prostitution, teen prostitution, sexual exploitation of youth, moving into domestic minor sex trafficking. That was a phrase that was used quite a bit there for a while, and then finally ending in the field, we call it CSEX. So commercial sexual exploitation of children is kind of the current way in which we talk about these kids that have been victimized and are surviving of the situation. For adults, we talk about, engagement in prostitution, pornography, forced trafficking, then moving into domestic sex trafficking, adult forced prostitution, and then finally that kind of current use of phrase is commercial sexual exploitation. So when I worked at New Friends, New Life, we would often talk about we were providing services and support to women who had experienced and survived sex trafficking or commercial sexual exploitation. And we'll talk a little bit about the differentiators between some of those, but just to see wanted you to see the progression of the language, and kind of the two bolded at the bottom are the phrases that we use currently to talk about those that have been impacted and are surviving this issue. So 3 typical elements when we're talking specifically about sex trafficking, and this can look similarly in labor trafficking as well. So the first element we have is the buyer or the John. So this is the person that is paying for purchasing of these victims. So they're the ones who are soliciting the service. And they kind of interchangeably get referred to as either one of those words, either buyer or John. The second component would then be the victim or the survivor. And these are the women, girls, boys, and men who are bought and sold for profit. And then the third element is then that trafficker or a pimp. Kind of those words often get used interchangeably as well. And they are the person who is exploiting the victim to earn a revenue from the buyer. So in a situation of sex trafficking, that trafficker or pimp is receiving usually all of the money that the victims are intaking from going out on these calls, on these jobs. And we'll talk more about how that plays itself out in a minute. But these 3 elements are key in talking about how this cycle gets perpetuated. You have to have each of these 3 pieces for trafficking to be occurring. Okay, so then some of the methods that are used, kind of the ways in which this plays itself out, or the locations where we see this happening. You can just see these listed here. We have pornography and child pornography. Escort prostitution is a part of that category. We'd say with commercial sexual exploitation, unless someone is going on a job as an escort but being sent by a trafficker, and then that would become sex trafficking. So that differentiator is that if a woman has been forced into by various reasons that we'll talk about shortly into engaging in commercial sexual exploitation, but they are receiving directly the payment for that looks a little bit different than if someone is being sent by their trafficker and the trafficker is then receiving all of the monetary response from that job. Sex tourism, I mentioned, and that goes the previous one. Pimp controlled prostitution is what the differentiator we were just talking about. Sex tourism is kind of, I mentioned earlier, about someone going to another country to solicit sex from people that are victims in their own country or have been brought to another country from somewhere else. We have delivery services, pedophile rings, forced marriage, or the idea of mail order brides, folks working in brothels or spas or saunas, massage parlors, street prostitution, and kind of you can see on this list. One of the things that I've worked with folks from different parts of the country, and it's really interesting in terms of depending on the geography of where you are. Some of these things have a much higher prevalence rate than others. So in Dallas, one of the things that we would do would be to ask when someone was coming in for services, kind of what experiences with either sex trafficking or commercial sexual exploitation had someone had, kind of in what locations and what forms or, areas of delivery. And street prostitution and strip clubs in Dallas were very large kind of areas of exposure and experience that the women we were serving had contact and connections with, versus talking with folks in other parts of the country. Those maybe were not as big of a thing. Strip clubs not being as big as they were in Dallas, and more leaning into spas or brothels or cantinas, depending on the area of the country that people were in. And I think that's important to know, just making yourself familiar, depending on where you are, what part of the country, what does this most commonly look like? Where is this most frequently happening? And educating yourself on kind of what the local way of kind of how this plays out, so that you have that information and know kind of where to be looking and kind of what to be watching for. So then if we look at across the globe, that this is not an issue that is happening in one place. This comes from Human Rights First, and this has been from 2014. So this has got about 10 years on. So I would imagine the numbers at this point are higher than they were here, because as we learn more and more, we're aware of more and more victims. But I think this is an important map to show that this is not just happening in other countries. This is not just happening in countries where we kind of have assumptions, or we've seen movies where it's going on, that this is happening all over the world in large numbers, including in the United States. This heat map comes from Polaris. Polaris is kind of the national organization that runs the National Human Trafficking Hotline in DC. And I think this is a really important map just to see kind of, again, same idea, that we want to assume often, and this goes for lots of issues, but we want to assume that this isn't happening to people around me or people in our area or in our city or in our state, because that makes it scary to think about that this is happening kind of in and around where I live and work and where my kids are. And so this really does show, right, this is happening all over our country. Obviously, the red color you can see is the higher levels of interaction, the higher levels of awareness of victimization and people that were being found and were reporting for services. Really looking at the coast, really looking at the middle. Dallas, for those of you in Texas, we really sit in kind of the center of the country. And so in terms of transportation, if we have someone working on the West Coast who needs to send people to the East Coast, a lot of folks coming in through the DFW airport. Texas, in terms of the country, is second behind California. Typically, the rates of victimization in California is the highest rate. Texas is second. Florida is third. That is kind of typically what we see. Part of that is due to the size and the size of the population of those states. More people means there's more people to be impacted. But I also think that shows the span across the country of how this is playing itself out. And then just an example of a local and one focused state. This was a study done by the Institute on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault, based out of the University of Texas at Austin. They did this study back in 2016. And what they found, I think, is really interesting, that 29 at that time, right, 29,000 or 79,000 minors and youth were victims of sex trafficking in Texas. And those were just the victims that they knew about through various means of, like, being, services were being provided, having been recovered, that sort of thing. So what I would say in all of these numbers is that the numbers are likely higher, because this is a notoriously challenging population to research and study, because in so many ways we rely on their self-disclosure to know about their experience. And for so many folks, they have not disclosed and don't disclose for a very long time. So just an important thing when you see statistics, kind of, my brain always kind of considers that the number is probably higher when thinking about this population. In Texas, 234,000 workers were victims of labor trafficking. So in total, that would mean 313,000 victims, and that traffickers were exploiting approximately $600 million from victims in terms of labor trafficking, and $6.6 billion in terms of sex trafficking. So the economic benefit to traffickers is incredibly high. They are making a great deal of money, and subsequently the consequences for them, when these cases do get prosecuted, is pretty low. So the risk reward ratio is not a great one. They have a lot of incentive to continue to do this, because they're making a lot of money, and there's not as harsh of penalties for them when they're getting caught. So just an important factor to keep in mind. These two slides come from an organization based out of New York City that I feel particularly grateful for, because I learned so much from from them. It is founded by Rachel Lloyd. She is a survivor. She wrote the book called Girls Like Us. It'll be at the end of the presentation. There's also a documentary that you can watch. The last time I checked, you could watch it on Max, but you may be able to see it in other locations now, called Very Young Girls. And it's a documentary based on looking at the organization in New York. It's called GEMS. And the work that they do providing services and interventions to minors who are impacted by sex trafficking. These two charts have been really helpful in terms of really understanding and thinking about, how does this happen, right? How does a girl find herself in this position? Because it is often a combination of things, and a combination of things that have been very traumatic that kind of contribute to her increased vulnerability to this. So if we look at the chart on the left, the wheel of demand, kind of that CSEC in the middle, again, that's the commercial sexual exploitation of children or child sex trafficking. And essentially what this wheel does is, if you look at kind of the outer ring and work your way in, it shows the systemic kind of issues in ways things in our society impact girls and create this kind of culture and petri dish that allows for this type of victimization to happen. So if we look at things like on the kind of 4 o'clock spot on that clock, the cultural acceptance of violence, right? We see violence in our news, in our movies, in our TV shows, that is very normalized at this point. We are desensitized to it significantly. And so then that progresses into violent sexual fantasies. If we think about, the ways in which pornography, increased access to pornography, and then the increased violence that is included in pornography creates then these violent sexual fantasies that people have, but maybe don't feel like they can or don't want to act out with their partner. And so then you move in the next ring on that diagram to violence towards individuals in the sex industry. So what we hear from survivors is that when they've engaged with these buyers or johns, that they often have these fantasies that they are wanting to act out, but they are choosing to do that with someone that are working or being forced into the sex industry, because they do not view them in the same way that they're viewing their partner. They view them as less than, they view them as an object. And so it is felt to be more acceptable on their part to be enacting these violence. So that's where we get, the incredibly high rates of abuse of individuals that are being trafficked just in these individual encounters. Certainly sexually abused, but also physically abused, verbally and emotionally abused as well. And you can do that with each of these rings. If you go around and look at racism, if you look at male privilege, if you look at the acceptance of buying sex from adults, and that there are no perceived consequences, this is a societal norm, leading into the dehumanization of women in the sex industry. So you can see all of these factors, and then the way that they create this dynamic that is seemingly more and more permissive of this as an experience. The chart on the right is this kind of spectrum or continuum of sexual abuse. So if you think about, if we think about a 15-year-old victim of child sex trafficking, where did things start for her? And it wasn't just that one day she woke up and was like, I think I'm going to go and talk to this trafficker and see if he can send me out on jobs so I can make a lot of money. That's not how that happens. It is not that she saw a music video that made working in the sex industry seem exciting or lucrative in terms of the financial means and thought that would be great. That's not how that goes. So if we back all the way up to the beginning of this spectrum of child sexual abuse. So typically what we see when all of the girls that I worked with at New Friends, New Life had some sort of experience early in their life with sexual abuse, stepfather, uncle, neighbor, grandfather, whomever. And you can see the progressive nature of what happens as this moves forward. So the beginning of the linking of love, quote unquote love, with sex and abuse, that this is what people do when they love you. This is how they show you that. The violation of her boundaries, and that her body is not for her. Her body is not for keeping safe. Her body is for someone else's pleasure and benefit. That leading then into guilt and shame and the way she feels about herself, and beginning to see herself only as a sexual object, that is what I'm good for. I can't tell you how many women that I sat with in my office who were sexually abused as children, then were beginning to be trafficked as teenagers, and then as adults continued on and told me that that is for the longest time all they thought they were good for, because that was the way they had been made to feel, because of their experience. That obviously leads to low self-esteem. And for, let's say, if we're talking about this 15-year-old girl, she's been abused, she decides she wants to run away, or she wants to get away from home if that's where the abuse is happening. So she starts skipping school, or she leaves. She is in places during the day when she typically would be in school, and traffickers are smart and they are business people, and they are looking for the individuals that are going to be more vulnerable and easier for them to control and manipulate. Because if someone has protective parents that are going to wonder where they are, or they're going to be tracking them, or going to be calling them, why are you not at school, that sort of thing, that's going to be a harder entry for a trafficker, versus if no one's watching this kid and she's on the bus or on the train, or she's at the mall during the day when everybody else her age is in school, maybe that's someone that trafficker wants to approach. Because if she runs away, or if she is not getting her needs met at home, that leads to poverty and need. And a trafficker knows how to meet those needs. That's the easiest way, is to go in and say, hey, I've noticed you here, let me buy you something to eat. Looks like your phone is cracked, let me go buy you a new phone. Looks like I saw this outfit that would look great on you, let me go get you some new clothes. And for kids who are living in homes where they are being abused, and or some of their needs are being neglected and they are not being protected, those things may feel really powerful, and may feel really impactful, in terms of someone is seeing me, someone is seeing my needs, someone wants to take care of me. And that is an intoxicating feeling. And so goes with this person. There's then things being bought, things being done, that leads to then unequal power dynamics between an adult and a child, because this adult, the trafficker, has the ability to buy things for this person. And you can follow that through there. But eventually, that initial, what feels like saving her from a situation that feels harmful, becomes, I need you to do a favor for me. I've got a friend, here's what I want you to do, and begins to send her out on these jobs. And then she realizes she maybe doesn't want to keep doing this. And at that point, a trafficker will often say, yeah, when you can pay me back for the clothes I bought you, the food I bought you, the phone I bought you, then you can leave, right? But you are in debt to me, and so you need to work off your debt. We call that debt bondage in the field. The problem with that, right, is that she's a kid. She can't get a job that is going to pay her enough outside of doing what he's asking her to do to pay back this debt. And as long as she continues to stay with him and he continues to spend money on her, she is just continuing to accrue more and more debt, which is then what leads to that feeling of being trapped, that I don't know how to get out of here. I don't know how to get away from this person. I don't know what else to do, which is a terrifying feeling. And that's how women that I worked with got stuck for years with the trafficker, because that was the situation they were in and they didn't know how to get away from it. Their parents were either not helpful or supportive, or their parents were mad at them for leaving, or their parents blamed them for what they did. And so they felt very stuck in the situation. Okay, so what are the factors then? Kind of, we talked through a little bit of these, but that lead to increased risk. A lack of education. Certainly if someone is for whatever reason, dropping out of school, whether that's that they are running away because they aren't safe at home, or school is challenging, or they've been asked to go to work by their family. Maybe their family is living in poverty and they need them to be working, but that lack of education makes it harder than when they're trying to leave, because it's harder to get a job, especially the older they are. And especially as we get into a 17-year-old that turns 18, that turns a child victim of trafficking into an adult victim of trafficking. And the response to those two individuals, unfortunately, in our society is often very different. We, as a society, my experience has been that we love to get behind a child victim of sex trafficking. We want to help them. We want to rescue them. We want to do all these things. But the moment she becomes an adult, the moment it somehow has magically become her choice to engage in this, and that she should just be able to leave. And it is It is not that easy. All the factors that made it challenging for her to leave as a kid are the same factors that make it hard for her to leave as an adult. Family instability, housing instability or homelessness, living in poverty, substance abuse, the history of abuse in the home, of family violence and or trauma. If home is not safe, like we were talking about in that example, and I would like to get away from this environment where I don't feel either safe from the people who are supposed to be keeping me safe, or I don't feel valued, or I feel being taken advantage of, or maybe there's substance abuse happening in my home that I don't want to be around. All of these things lead to an environment where a trafficker sees those needs, sees the vulnerabilities, and can swoop in and play that role of Prince Charming. Often the substance abuse piece can play into a girl and woman's victimization as well, because either a trafficker will give her drugs to make the experience of going out on jobs easier for her, or she is looking for drugs to, if there's an active addiction already and they are coming and saying, yes, we'll help with that and get you what you need, and then continues to propel that addiction, and then she is stuck in that as well, because that addictive, she is being given the thing that addiction is wanting by this person who's causing her incredible additional harm. History of involvement in systems of child protection, foster care, and criminal justice system. All of that is there. In those ways, there are fewer safe adults that are having eyes on kiddos, right? That there are increased levels of vulnerability. There is maybe inconsistent caregiving, shifting around to different people, which then again a trafficker sees and can kind of swoop in and play that role. Kids that identify as LGBT IA plus community, for the simple fact that they get kicked out of their homes. Oftentimes they're not accepted by their parents, and so they either get kicked out or they run away, which makes them out in the environment and more prone to being approached by a trafficker as well. And then anybody that has a disability, particularly an intellectual disability, for the same reason, that the traffickers see those folks as more vulnerable and more easily controllable and able to be manipulated because of the disability that they have. So an important thing in all of this work, as you are potentially engaging with folks who are having had this experience, is the stages of change. We as humans do not change linearly, and we do not change quickly. And so really part of the intervention is recognizing where is somebody in this process of change. There has been so much research, and you can read all sorts of things on the stages of change, so I won't spend a ton of time on it, but I do think it's really important to consider and to conceptualize where somebody is, because that then informs how we engage with them. If someone is early in the stages of change, pre-contemplative or contemplative, we want to be providing a lot of information and not a whole lot of pressure, not a lot of action, because they are just tiptoeing into even identifying that this is my experience, right? They may very much be saying that the trafficker, this is my boyfriend, he cares about me, he loves me, and if we come in kind of firing off that you're a trafficking victim and you need to get away from him, all that's going to do is shut her down and not continue to leave the lines of communication open. So just trying to assess, where is she in this? And then how do I provide information that's going to meet her where she is, so that we can help move the needle as much as we can. With that, I think really important to consider as well that the stages of change, these systems have to be taken into account to fully understand and really grasp kind of where someone is in the stages of change and how those stages are being informed by what someone's experience is. So we think about sexism, classism, racism, poverty, lack of affordable childcare, lack of affordable housing. If I'm coming in and I've got a kiddo who was living in poverty, did not have stable housing, was moving often, maybe is a race that is a person of color, and so there are these systems that are being stacked against them. It's not as simple as just, oh, where she's pre-contemplative and now we're going to move into contemplation. There are things that some of this has leaned into and assisted. If I have lived forever in an unstable housing situation, and because I've been with this trafficker, there's been more stability and there's been increased kind of, I haven't had to move. That's going to be a factor in my recognition of what's happening to me, and the recognition of my experience and victimization, and my willingness and readiness to leave the situation. So having to think through, how has each of these areas impacted this person's life, and then how have those things been also impacted, excuse me, by that trafficker. And so it's this idea we talked a lot about at New Friends, New Life of, we've got to come in and assess what are the needs, and what are the needs that the trafficker has been meeting, and how do we begin to take over meeting those needs in a different way, so that she gets to have a different perspective on what's going on. Okay, Carrie, I think this is you.
It is. Okay, so for any attorneys who are attending today's webinar that are in the states of Nebraska, Texas, and Washington, for your CLE requirements, you will need to include the following attendance code in your evaluation form. The code is 33681. Once again, the code is 33681. Thank you, Jessica.
Yep. Okay, 33681. There you go. Okay, so the 3 C's of support. We use this often. This did not come from me. This is from a great book called Social Work Practice with Victims, or with, excuse me, with Survivors of Sex Trafficking and Commercial Sexual Exploitation. It is a dense book. It is worth the buy if you can find it online or in bookstores. This came from that, and we use that book as a huge resource at New Friends, New Life. It is very well done, but they talk in that book about the 3 C's of support, and we leaned into this a lot. So those C's are consistency, close engagement, and continued resources. In terms of service provision to survivors, what are the things that we can do that are going to lead to the greatest amount of safety? Because where there is safety, that's where we can make some movement and help with some changes. So in terms of consistency, right? We talked all the time about, we want to show up as service providers, as professionals in this field, being as close to the same and as we can in every engagement with the survivor, so that she begins to know each time that she engages with me, she knows exactly what I'm going to be like. She knows what to expect. She knows what I'm going to say. She knows what my, demeanor will be like, what my tone will be like. Because where there is consistency leads to predictability. She can begin to predict that. And then where there is predictability leads to safety. And that's what we're looking for. Close engagement. So working really closely with her, that there are, for individuals that are trying to either escape a trafficker or who have maybe gotten away but are trying to rebuild their life, there are a million different ways in which that road is a hard road. If I began to be trafficked when I was 15, I was with my trafficker for 10 years. I maybe had a kid with my trafficker, and I'm now 25. I don't have a legal work history. I have a child that I'm needing to provide for, and I have no money, right? That road forward is a really challenging road. And so there is absolutely support for her to help make her life look the way she wants it to look, but we can strive to be as closely engaged with her as possible, meaning, looking for all of those ways in which she has needs that we can intervene on. And then continued resources. So just continuing to provide, no matter what the need that's coming up, finding ways to meet those needs. I love this quote. It talks about that the actions and attitudes of a provider, I'm going to move my little window here so I can see. Well, not responsible for the change process, can and do make significant difference in how an individual engages and responds to the provider, builds trust and rapport with the provider, and is able to receive intentional and directive support in moving to the next stage. So it's just talking about that, while the change process is not our responsibility, we can absolutely make an impact on it based on how we show up, the way we engage. And then that line at the bottom was kind of our tagline, always at New Friends New Life, that people connect to people, not programs. So we can have the best, most extensive program available, but if we do not have relationship with these amazing individuals that we are serving, these brave, smart, capable people, then those programs don't matter, because they're not going to come. They're not going to want to engage in the same way. And so that relational piece of this is so, so very important. Creating that safety, creating that connection that will let her feel like, okay, this person or these people here have my back. They're on my team. They want good things for me, and they are working to help me with that. Let me see. Okay. So then looking at some red flags, and I'm going to go through these pretty quickly just for the sake of time and leaving time for questions, but you will also be getting these slides and you'll have them as well. So watching for things like physical and sexual violence being an everyday reality. So examples of that and visible signs of that, like bruises, black eyes, cuts, marks, that sort of thing. And I should say, going into this list of red flags, as with any list of red flags about things like this, issues like this, one red flag does not necessarily mean that that's a smoking gun, unless there are a couple that certainly are. But where we begin to add red flag after red flag after red flag is where we want to pay increasing amounts of attention. So one thing, again, is not a for sure that this kid is being trafficked, but if we begin to have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of these all together is where we want to be asking more questions. So exhibiting behaviors including fear, anxiety, depression, submission, that sort of thing, kind of hypervigilance or paranoid behavior. For kids, any relationships with adults or older men that seem to be engaging in a way that is not a typical way that a child would be engaging with an adult. Increased truancy or tardiness from school, evidence of controlling relationships. So things like repeated phone calls from their boyfriend, having a second phone, having a phone that they always have to have with them and have to be answering, and expressed concern about displeasing their partner. Unexplained shopping trips or possession of expensive clothing, especially for kids who don't have the means to have things like that. If you know a kid's kind of where they are and how kind of the socioeconomic status of their family, and they have many items that would not match with some of that, being curious about where they came from. If they're not in control of their own money, some of this lingo or slang around the life, and then watching for, and obviously not wanting to shame people for wearing sexually provocative clothing, but also just paying attention to that. Do we have 13-year-olds dressing in a way that an adult would dress? And is that a sudden change from how they have typically dressed before? That sort of thing. Difficulty making or avoiding eye contact. Sometimes traffickers or pimps will do things that are like branding. So having tattoos that are the logo of a trafficker, or traffickers will have their street name that they will use. And so is that something that is present on her body? Also having tattoos sometimes that are in not standard or typical places, looking like around the neck or in places that feel potentially like they are being used in a possessive way, are things to just be watching for. A sexually explicit online profile. This is kind of internet chat rooms, back pages no longer there, but kind of using the internet as a way to engage. OnlyFans would be a new version of that, kind of in the more present day. Doctors and nurses can consider frequent or multiple regular STIs, pregnancies, or abortions, and then homeless or runaway children that are living in foster care or group homes. Are things to all be watching for. These are some of those resources. So that book on the left is the book I mentioned that has the 3 C's, the idea that people connect to people and not programs. If you have not read The Body Keeps the Score, highly recommend it in terms of just understanding what is happening for folks when they have been traumatized. And then Girls Like Us is that book by Rachel Lloyd, who is the executive director of GEMS in New York City. Rachel, I don't think I mentioned as well, it was helped to co-author that federal legislation back in 2000, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. She has been a leader in this field, kind of from the very inception of the work that we have had in this country to support survivors coming out of this experience. So highly recommend that book to get a sense of what her own experience was, and how she has used that to impact and influence this field. And I think that is the last slide. So we can move into some questions.
Yes, thank you, Jessica. I'm so
Sure.
thankful for that last slide. We had lots of people asking for you to restate the name of the book. So that is super helpful. If we can leave that slide up for a little bit for
Sure.
people to be
Yeah.
able to write these resources down. That would be great. You also mentioned a movie or documentary. Someone asked if you'd please restate that.
Yes, the documentary is called Very Young Girls, and it is about GEMS in New York City, which is the organization that Rachel Lloyd, the book on the right, runs.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
Melissa, if you could do me a favor and upload the PowerPoint slides one more time into the chat. I think if people signed on late, you only see the chat when it begins once you signed on. So they may have missed that since it was one of the first chats you sent. And I do have some questions just that people have
Sure.
posted. Let's see, I'll get to this first one. Under the methods used, have you seen an increase in virtual exploitation? That is, the trafficker having the victim record videos that are then sold throughout Instagram, OnlyFans, or other social media apps. We've had several of those as aspects of our cases here in Houston, Texas.
Yeah. Um, yes, there was a huge online involvement and engagement with the folks we served at New Friends, New Life. Um, whether that be through OnlyFans, whether that be through kind of social media. We talked a lot with parents of the girls that had parents that were engaged in support there about, being communicative with their kids about who they're connecting with online, who they're engaging with on social media. Do they know this person in real life? But yes, as our society becomes increasingly digital, as does online exploitation for sure.
Got it. Thank you. Another question that someone posed was, I was taught that third parties are not required for it to be considered CSEC or child sexual exploitation, such as an alleged perpetrator gives child money for performing sex acts on them, or a kid
Mhm.
gets out of the house and trades sex acts for a place to stay. Can you say more about that, about it having to include a third party?
Yes, that's right. So for a child, because you don't have to prove that force, fraud, or coercion, then any engagement by a child in a commercial sex act would be considered child sex trafficking. For an adult, because there has to be that force, fraud, or coercion element, that begins to look differently around that exchange. Leading into kind of the differentiating between commercial sexual exploitation and trafficking.
Got it. Thanks for the distinction. So this distinction is between whether the victim's a child or an adult.
Yes.
Someone asked the slide that you showed that was kind of the word cloud with the numbers from Texas.
Yes.
Was that in 1 year or what was the collection time
I
frame?
believe so. Yes, I believe that was over the course of 1 year. That study was done in 2016. I think it's still on their website. That's the Institute on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault at the University of Texas in Austin. But yes, I believe the time frame was over a 1 year period.
Got it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Someone asked on the map that you showed, why isn't New York a top trafficking state? Do you know why and what are they doing different than, say,
Yeah.
California? Texas?
That's a great question. I actually don't know the answer to that, about why their numbers wouldn't be as high. I do just anecdotally, and engaging, there are a large number in a very concentrated period space, of service providers in the Northeast, in the New England area. And so I wonder if that has something to do with it. I think there's still a very high rate of trafficking happening in New York and in New England. But I don't know if that has something to do with why the number maybe isn't as high, or why it wouldn't be up there with California and Texas and Florida. It may be the fourth though. I would need to check on that to see. It may be right there behind too.
Yeah, someone just commented that it's actually number 5, so it's still kind of up there, but yeah,
Yeah.
that's great information.
Mhm.
Um, let's see. Okay, what are some examples someone asked of labor trafficking?
Mm. Yeah. So if someone is engaging in, if we think about areas of either working in agriculture or working in housekeeping or working in areas where there is not oversight by a company, perhaps, and is being sent, if a person is being sent out on this job and then all of their wages they're being paid are being given back to the person who sent them, and they're not being compensated for the work that they're doing. So they're being forced to do the work and then forced to give their money to this person. Those would be examples of labor trafficking. We see the overlap often of labor trafficking with sex trafficking in places like illicit massage parlors. So there are people that are working, providing massages that are maybe not of a sexual nature, and then also being forced to live in that location and also be providing there's sex trafficking happening as well. So that would be a location and an example where both are actually happening at the same time.
Yeah, great explanation.
Yeah,
Thank you.
sure.
Someone asked, what is the age to be considered a child? Is it the same federally as it is state? Does that vary state to state?
It varies state to state. In terms of if there's a federal age, I do not remember that off the top of my head. I would need to look, but I can tell you that each state has a different age with which they deem the age of consent, which they deem the age of kind of what that looks like in terms of children or minors being able to consent in sex.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Someone said, I noticed survival sex as part of the list of methods in your presentation. I've not heard of this term. Can you define this?
Sure. Yeah. Survival sex, we asked about that often at New Friends New Life, and it was something that most all of the folks we served checked off, because survival sex is that exchanging of sex for things you need to survive. So exchanging sex for housing, exchanging sex for food, exchanging sex for clothes, which kind of falls into, for adults, that commercial sexual exploitation camp. So if I am 25 and I lost my job and I have 2 kids and I'm gonna go, I have a neighbor who says, I'll pay for y'all to have your family to have food, but you got to have sex with me in order for me to do that. That would be considered survival sex.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Another one here. In your experience, are federal prosecutions of trafficking more advantageous than a local or state prosecution? Do you opinion on that?
I don't feel like I'm probably qualified to speak to that. I will say that in my experience, I've seen where federal prosecutions have gotten higher, like longer sentences for people that have been convicted of trafficking. So that's anecdotal, and that's my experience, because I'm not an attorney and I haven't studied that closely enough. But that has been what I've seen, at least in Dallas.
Got it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we have time for a few more questions. Are there ways to identify trafficking websites or chat groups? And what are some of those apps that we should be on the lookout for, if there are any?
I think certainly OnlyFans and anything that feels connected to online sexual activity, there's going to be things happening there that are. I heard a survivor named Rebecca Charleston speak one time, and she talked about how where there's smoke, there's fire. So if you go to a place like Las Vegas where prostitution is legalized, and that is not necessarily trafficking per se on the surface, there is going to be sex trafficking happening in a place like that. So any sort of online sexually oriented website, I would be willing to bet is going to be the same thing. There will be people there that are there and that are not necessarily engaging in trafficking, but there absolutely could be things happening that are unsafe and leaning in that direction.
Yeah, unfortunately, the predators are everywhere looking for
Yes.
vulnerable
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
This is a good question. What is the time frame in which, when a child goes missing, what is the time frame with which they could be lost into human trafficking if not found, say for a runaway or a child
Yeah.
that's
I don't remember where I heard the statistic, but it was very frequently used. But that if a child runs away, that it is within typically 48 hours that they are approached by a trafficker. So if they're gone for 48 hours or longer, that's kind of the threshold where they are likely to be kind of approached. Now, does that mean that they're going to be kind of lost to human trafficking? I think the question said not necessarily. There are also kids that are being trafficked that are living in their homes with their parents, and that their parents are not aware that that's happening. And so that, depending on the dynamic and the way that's playing out, could look differently. I think if we talk about like the Jeffrey Epstein case and the girls that were being trafficked, those girls were all living in homes with their caregivers, with their parents. And so that can be the way that happens as well. But the statistic I often heard was 48 hours is kind of the danger mark in terms of time away from home.
Yeah, it's not very long.
No.
Okay, from your years of experience, could you provide tips regarding best practice when making initial contact with these youth? Our team encounters recovered children in a hospital setting. We are supporting the recovery of these children who may want to run away or not participate in needed medical evaluations and or become escalated. Any insight and advice would be helpful.
Yeah. Um, I think that's where all those trauma-informed care practices are really powerful and important. So, in those 3 C's, that consistency, continued resources, I think the way in which we show up with someone, especially a scared kid in a hospital, is really important. So if we can be kind, unassuming, we talked a lot at New Friends, New Life about, being aware of ourselves in the room. So making my tone soft, not making a ton of very intense eye contact. If I can sit side by side with a kid rather than looking at them head on, sometimes that feels more comfortable. Giving them a lot of space, providing them with, if there's things that would be helpful that are just kind of fun. Can I get you a snack? Can I get you a stuffed animal? Can I get you, that sort of thing? And then not expecting them to immediately trust you, right? We don't want them to be immediately trusting of adults that they don't know. That's part of what got, led to where they are. And so we want there to be some wariness around, I don't know you, I've been told by my trafficker perhaps not to trust anyone, not to talk to anyone. And so kind of going in with the assumption almost that they're going to push you away and they're not going to want to engage with you, and not taking that personally, and just continue to be consistent in, I'm right here. We talked a lot about being small and still in the room, right? And so, if I need to kneel down or crouch down, using a low tone of voice, not getting too close to them, not sitting too close or standing too close, but just being really mindful of ourselves and going in with that assumption as well. Like, I don't think they're going to trust me. And so how do I be consistent to show up and provide these small, tiny things that let this kid know that I'm safe and I'm here to help support them.
Right. Great advice. Are there particular age groups or racial groups that are more at risk of trafficking than others?
Yeah, we talked all the time at New Friends, New Life that women and girls of color are at much higher rates and a much higher risk of being trafficked. And that goes back to that slide on the systems that impact the stages of change. If we think about, and also that wheel of demand. So if you go back to the wheel of demand that Rachel Lloyd created and look at racism, right? That racism has led to inequity in all sorts of ways that then create increased vulnerabilities for women and girls of color. And that the way that white buyers are typically white men, that's what the statistics show us, and that often is part of the racism built in within that, of not viewing people that have been trafficked or sex workers as the same as themselves, and that plays a role in that factor too.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to do this one final question, Jessica. If the attendees today could take away just one point from your presentation, what would you hope that would be?
I think the thing that always stands out to me is that these individuals who are survivors of sex trafficking are really incredible humans. They have had these terrible things happen to them, and they are survivors who are smart and capable. And if we can kick down barriers and open doors to let them have the life that they deserve and want, we should do that. And that they're really they deserve that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, it looks like we're reaching the end of our time today. For those of you who submitted a question and didn't get your question answered, we are going to email Jessica all of your questions. She will answer them and they will be sent out via email. So you will get your question answered. Just sorry we couldn't answer them all live today. Please, once again, be on the lookout for an email later this afternoon that will give you instructions on how to complete the evaluation form, receive your certificate of attendance, and contact our presenter if you would like to. Jessica, thank you so very much for your time today. This was incredible information. You're so amazing and such an expert in the area. And on behalf of all of us at Guardify, thank you, and we appreciate you.
Thanks so much. It was great being with you guys.